Welcome to today's call. Insurrection at the Capitol. Where do we go from here? I am Russ Feingold, the president of the American Constitution Society. We are all grieving today. We are grieving the loss of life and the reality that the foundations of our democracy appear shaky at best. For the first time since the War of 1812, our Capitol building, our citadel of liberty that I was honored and humbled to work in for close to 2 decades, was under siege just 48 hours ago. Egged on by President Trump's refusal to accept his electoral defeat, this was an attack on the very foundations of our democracy. Make no mistake, these were not protesters. These were rioters incited to violence by government officials. In the wake of this assault, we have to ask, what's next? How do we recover from this assault? How do we heal our democracy and punish those responsible? Both those who physically breached the Capitol walls and those who incited the violence. Should the president be removed from office? And what can and should be done in response to law enforcement's relative inaction in the face of mobs who infiltrated the Capitol complex as compared to the treatment of Black Lives protesters last year? At this moment of crisis, the work of ACS has never been more vital. So I'm really thankful to our speakers for agreeing to participate in this call today on very short notice, and to all of you for being with us. So now I'm going to turn it over to ACS's Director of Policy and Program, Deborah Perlin. Thanks for putting this together so quickly and effectively, Deborah, and you will get the conversation started. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Russ. 2 quick housekeeping notes before we get started. First, please note that today's call is being recorded and the recording will be available after the call. Second, if you'd like to ask a question at any time during the call, please type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll be taking questions after our presenters are finished with their remarks, and we'll try to address as many as possible. We are so glad that Professor Steve Vladeck and Professor Cami Chaffis have agreed to be with us today. We will first hear from Professor Vladeck. Professor Vladeck is the A. Dalton Cross Professor in Law at the University of Texas School of Law, where he focuses on issues of constitutional law, national security law, and military justice. Professor Vladeck's scholarship has been featured in an array of legal publications, including the Harvard Law Review, the Yale Law Journal, and his popular writing has appeared in forums ranging from the New York Times to BuzzFeed News. Together with Professor Bob Chasney, he is also the co-host of the popular National Security Law podcast. And perhaps most importantly for our purposes, we at ACS are also proud to have him as a member of our ACS's Board of Academic Advisors. Professor Vladeck will walk us through the constitutional questions related to presidential removal and the national security questions raised by Wednesday's mob. After Steve, we'll hear from Professor Chaffis. Professor Chaffis is a professor of law and director of the Criminal Justice Program at Wake Forest University School of Law, where her scholarship focuses on issues related to criminal law, criminal procedure, and criminal justice reform. A frequent contributor to national and international media outlets, her writings have appeared in the New York Times and Huffington Post, among others. Professor Chaffis is a former assistant U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia, and importantly for our purposes, the faculty advisor for the Wake Forest ACS Students Chapter. She'll talk about the prosecutorial options for the rioters and police conduct and misconduct issues. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Vladeck.
Great. Thank you, Deborah. Thanks, Cami. It's great to see you guys. Russ, too. I wish we were under better circumstances, but still nice to see some friendly faces. So we really do want to leave as much time as possible for discussion and Q&A. So I'm going to go fairly quickly through some of the big questions, leaving, I think, some of the more important criminal law questions to Cami. But so with regard to what happened on Wednesday, let me talk about some of the sort of big picture, eye-dropping federal criminal possibilities. Right, so some folks on the internet are wondering, well, was it treason? That one's easy. No. We're not at war. There's no other side that these folks were aligning themselves with or fighting on behalf of. What they were doing was far more classically understood as what many are calling it, which is insurrection. And here's how the U.S. Code defines insurrection. It's 18 U.S.C. Section 2383. And it says, whoever incites, sets on foot, assists, or engages in any rebellion or insurrection against the authority of the United States, right? And so the insurrection, right, is attempting to overthrow the authority of the federal government, attempting to use force to resist and subvert the democratic government. What makes this different, of course, is that it was not just a riot. It was an assault on Congress in the middle of the joint session that was specifically meeting for the purpose of confirming who exactly will hold the authority of the United States on January 20th. That's really why this is so, at least legally, categorically different from, some of the acts of violence we saw over the past 6-7 months, in other cities. The other statute that I think folks are talking about, at least from the national security law side of things, and again, there's a raft of other offenses that I know Cammie's going to say a bit about, is seditious conspiracy. Seditious conspiracy is if 2 or more persons in any state conspire to overthrow, put down, or destroy by force the government of the United States, or to levy war against them, or to oppose by force the authority thereof, or by force to prevent, hinder, or delay the execution of any law of the United States. I've been pretty careful in my career, and especially over the last 4 years, in trying to sort of not use these terms to describe some of what we've seen. Wednesday comes about as close to an example of seditious conspiracy as we've seen in my lifetime. And it's hard to imagine what would be a seditious conspiracy under Section 2384 if some of what we saw on Wednesday was not. Not all of it, of course, just some of it. All right, so I want to leave Cammie, who's the real expert, for the rest of the criminal law side. Let me turn to what else might be going on. Remedies against those who might be responsible, right? Remedies against political actors. So, of course, for the members of Congress, for whom many find responsible for, if not the violence itself, and for encouraging it, for supporting it, the classic remedy is expulsion. Right, that Article 1, Section 3 provides for the expulsion. Section 7, provides for the expulsion of members upon a 2/3 vote of either chamber. And there's already been at least some discussion by some members of both the House and the Senate that I think it's 138 members of the House and 8 senators who voted to sustain objections to Biden's electors in Arizona and Pennsylvania should be expelled. I suspect that's not going to go anywhere, but it's at least a conversation worth having. There's been some discussion also about Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which provides that individuals who have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States may not hold office, and especially may not serve as senators or legislators. Here, I think, first of all, Section 3, when it has been used, which was principally after the Civil War, is usually used as a basis for not seating a member when they are elected. It's not usually a basis on its own, separate from the power to expel provided by Article 1. I also think it's a bit of a stretch to show that the members were themselves engaged in the insurrection, even if we think that they did not nearly enough to preclude it, and that some of their rhetoric may have helped to provoke it. And then, of course, we get to the question of the day, which is, what about the president? And with regard to the president, there are, of course, 2 remedies if he won't resign himself. There is the impeachment remedy. We've already heard that articles of impeachment have been introduced in the House. I believe the House is planning to vote on, to debate the articles and perhaps even vote on them as early as next week. And then, of course, there's a specter of a Senate trial. And part of why I think folks are especially harping upon the impeachment remedy, even with only 12 days left in the president's tenure, is because one of the consequences of a successful removal from the Senate can be permanent disqualification from ever holding another office under the United States. And so, although there's some debate in the literature about whether that's automatic if the Senate votes to remove, or whether the Senate actually has to take a second vote, it's certainly at least on the table that even if this may seem like the clock is running out and the president's going to be out of office by the time the Senate's done, there's still a downstream potential consequence, a downstream potential remedy that might make it worth pursuing. And it certainly at least would make it a live issue even after January 20th. But part of why I think there's been a lot of discussion of the 25th Amendment is because even that process will take some time. And for those who are worried that the president should be immediately removed from power, the only constitutional mechanism is Section 4 of the 25th Amendment. But of course, that requires the vice president and a majority of, not the cabinet, but a majority of department heads So not the entire cabinet, the CIA director doesn't count, but rather the 15 department heads, so 8 of the 15, to send a letter to Congress saying that they do not believe the president is any longer able to discharge the duties of his office. Of course, the president can then send his own letter saying, actually, I'm fine. And then there would have to be a second letter from the vice president and a majority of the department heads. And here's where things get interesting. The timeline from there, as set forth in the 25th Amendment, is that Congress must meet within 48 hours to debate whether the vice president should become the acting president or whether the president should be restored to office. And it must decide that question within 21 days. But the 25th Amendment also makes clear that until Congress decides the question, the acting president is the vice president, right? That is to say, the second letter from the vice president removes the president from power temporarily, at least until Congress votes. And this is, I think, why a lot of folks think this is worth discussing right now, because that would be both an immediate remedy and Congress could then simply run out the clock. That as opposed to even having to vote on whether the president should be permanently removed from office, if we hit noon on January 20th, that matter becomes moot. So, these are obviously not exactly topics that we thought we'd have to discuss on a regular basis. They're immensely grave. None of them should be considered lightly. But, the mechanisms are not powerless when it comes to what to do in a situation like this. And so I think one of the real questions is whether there's the political will to pursue some of these mechanisms, because the legal mechanisms, the legal tools really are there. Reports from earlier today are that the vice president has no interest in invoking the 25th Amendment. I think Secretary Carson put out a statement that he has no interest in, pursuing a 25th Amendment remedy. So that's probably just still an academic discussion for the moment. But at the risk of being a bit of a sort of, worrier, there's still 12 days until the president's no longer the president. And there's no reason to believe that what happened on Wednesday is the last time he's going to do something wholly unbecoming his office before he no longer holds it. So I'm going to sort of stop there, even though there's so much more to discuss, because I want to get out of the way and turn the floor over to Cami.
Great, thank you, Steve, and thank you, Russ and Deborah, for inviting me to this discussion. So I agree with everything that Steve has said, and I have kind of a few points that I want to move through. First, there are the lower level crimes that we want to discuss, and some of the nuances regarding some of the charges there. And I want to talk about the importance of bringing those individuals to justice, because we haven't seen, relatively speaking, we haven't seen a lot of arrests when we look at the number of people that were there and the damage that was done, and we know that was perpetrated. So I want to talk about the importance of bringing those folks to justice, and a little bit about how prosecutors might do that, the evidence and things that they would use. And then I want to talk about understanding how it is that so many of these crimes that the rioters had the opportunity to commit, so many of these crimes. What we were looking at is what we saw on January 6th was a systemic security breach. Those in the world of police accountability, we always know that the individual officer is responsible for their actions, but in terms of any use of force that's used or not used. But what we saw here was a little bit different. We have some systemic failures, and we know that these failures are usually rooted in an organizational culture, and we look to top leadership. So we will need to find out what happened, what's going on within, in particular, the Capitol Police. In particular, and so that we can rectify it moving forward. And then finally, I do want to spend some time analyzing and thinking about the appalling disparities that we saw between how law enforcement interacted with these rioters and how they handled, how, again, the same agencies handled the largely peaceful Black Lives Matter protests this spring and summer. And again, the disparities, we can talk about them. They were there, but it's more important to understand why we have to address it and the impact that seeing those disparities can have on our democracy. So first, when you think about the crimes, Steve's talked about the seditious conspiracy and the like, but a lot of the protesters, and I don't want to call them protesters, many of them were certainly rioters. I mean, we have a litany. If you think about issue spotting for a criminal law exam, you would not be able to discuss all of the crimes that we saw committed. But prosecutors are going to have to sit down and they're going to have to go through. There's unlawful entry, into the federal building there, felony theft, felony destruction of property, assault on federal law enforcement officers. We saw, and I've seen the video, I know we all have seen multiple videos, but there were Capitol police officers just, holding barriers, and there were rioters who actively went up and punched them and shoved them. And I have to step back, and also communicating threats. And this is something really interesting. I did prosecute cases in Washington, D.C., and communicating threats. When I worked at the U.S. Attorney's Office, this is a crime, sometimes, it's a misdemeanor. You could spend up to 6 months in jail for saying you were going to beat up so-and-so or kick so-and-so's, what. And unfortunately, these charges disproportionately, again, reserved or leveled against racial minorities. And I'm sure there's some statistics that would bear that out, but we certainly saw communicating threats at the very least on Capitol Hill that day. And then there are, the pipe bombs that were placed, that were found. Again, is this, attempted murder charges. And then sadly, there were deaths that were caused as a direct result of the protests and of the security breach. So you have the rioter that entered the Capitol building and was shot by, I believe it was probably Capitol Police or maybe Secret Service. We don't know yet, maybe until the investigation is full, but it was a law enforcement officer that's been placed on administrative leave. And with that, are there felony murder charges that are available again to prosecute those who were also in the rotunda at that point? And then again, sadly, this morning we learned that Officer Brian Seidnick was injured and succumbed to his injuries. And so there's absolutely a homicide charge that prosecutors should be looking into, and as well as, again, the possibility of felony murder charges, depending on what the circumstances were and who was around. So a litany of charges. And of possible charges. And when we think about this, if we go back to first principles, I always tell my criminal law students, you can't punish if the punishment would not align with the underlying theories of punishment, right? Utilitarianism or retribution, then you shouldn't punish, you shouldn't engage in it. But here it's so important that we understand the utilitarian principles, specifically specific deterrence and general deterrence. What we saw unfold and the mob, we cannot have these same individuals, many of whom are known to the general public, their faces and their social media. We cannot have them go unpunished for their deeds if we're able to prove every element beyond a reasonable doubt, because they will, what will prevent them from going to a state capitol or other state buildings or federal buildings again and engaging in the same behavior if they're not punished? And again, general deterrence, you have to send a message that you can peacefully protest, but when it crosses the line to assaulting officers and felony, and destruction of property, and then the huge national security interests that are implicated here. This wasn't just any building. This was a building, and they interrupted or disrupted the business of Congress. And that's another actual federal statute and crime under which they can be prosecuted. So how will various law enforcement agencies go about prosecuting and finding these people? The investigations, I think, are it's easy for us to sit back and criticize and say, oh, they're going too slow. But my hope and my faith in many of the career prosecutors that we have and in the FBI is that they are going to be combing the social media, using all the tools available to law enforcement to identify these people and to appropriately assess their roles in the mayhem that happened. But the other thing that we have to think about is, again, how did this occur? And we had so many officers injured. Again, the systemic failures and the lack of preparedness that we saw with the federal agencies. There was not only a systemic failure among one agency, but the lack of coordination amongst the agencies as well that we didn't see. And this is the question. This is why there should be an independent investigation that we didn't see in the Black Lives Matter protest this summer. But we can even think back to the J20 protests when President Trump was first inaugurated. I recall the DC police, Metropolitan Police, using a tactic called kettling, where they would round up mass numbers of protesters and put them in a certain place. Now, the problem, and constitutionally, was that a lot of mass arrests occurred, and a lot of people were arrested who there was not probable cause to believe that they had actually engaged in some of the crimes. We have a lot less of that here because when you see people breaching the Capitol building and again, and some active resistance to and disobeying law enforcement's orders. So the use of police tactics was it a failure in training as well? And again, so I'm calling for an independent investigation. I say independent because again, there will be a segment of society that doesn't trust or doesn't believe that this happened. And we really want people to understand that that a fair and impartial investigation took place into what happened. And finally, I will just leave with the disparities that we saw and the way in which protesters had been treated, because that's not to say we could think about ratcheting up. It's not to say, well, you treated the Black Lives Matter protesters this way, so we should ratchet up and treat these people, in the same way. If they were peacefully protesting, you wouldn't want to see that ratcheting up. You'd want to have the protections that they would deserve. But there's a marked difference here between the behavior, the largely peaceful protests that we saw this summer, and the behavior that was displayed on Capitol Hill January 6th. And it's also what we know in terms of when we think about police accountability, officers are allowed to use force as a part of their jobs. It's just that that force has to be reasonable. And so often, a police officer only has to say, I feared for my life. I feared for my life. And so they're able to shoot with impunity a Black or brown person and face no consequences because it would be deemed reasonable. But what we saw on Capitol Hill January 6th is that police can and do use restraint in certain circumstances. And the fact that we had one death is too many, but the fact that there weren't more deaths is, again, it's very surprising, but it also shows the restraint that they were able to show. And we have to ask, why isn't that reserved? Why is that reserved for these rioters and potentially seditious conspirators rather than a Black man, Andre Hill, in his garage, in a neighbor's garage, and simply turning around, he's immediately gunned down. And so the last, a lot of surveys will show that, like a recent Pew survey, 79% of Blacks say that they feel that the criminal justice system treats them differently. And we see this. And so we cannot afford to have, again, the legitimacy of our institutions continually questioned. So we have to have an independent investigation as to what happened. And now we know that police officers can and do, well, we've always known, I'll say this and I'll conclude, but we've always known that restraint can be shown. And there are some jurisdictions that say you don't have to shoot first and ask questions later. You can actually exhaust all of your other remedies. There's been so much resistance to changing use of force policies in local communities to that standard, to say that you don't have to resort to deadly force. You should exhaust all of your possibilities. And we saw that in action on Capitol Hill. So I think many members of the Black community would say, and so why not that for our communities? Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you for getting this conversation started. There are a number of questions that have come in the chat, and I just kind of want to bring it into our conversation. So the first one has to do with, I didn't know about this. There was an article that Josh Blackman, I guess, wrote this week arguing that Trump cannot be impeached for inciting Wednesday's assault on the Capitol because the First Amendment protects his speech. And I was just wondering if either of you could respond to that. Maybe that, I don't know if Cammie or Steve wants to take that one. You're laughing, Cammie.
Laughing because it's just wrong. I mean, it's a blog post on Vol Conspiracy this morning by Josh and by Seth Barrett Tillman. And it's just wrong. I mean, it's wrong on the facts, it's wrong on the law, it's wrong on the historical precedent. Impeachment is not limited to criminal offenses. If it were, then the president could not be impeached even though he takes no action to repel a foreign invasion. I think that would surprise the founders quite a bit, right? So put that aside. But let's indulge the hypothetical for a second and say, all right, well, what if that were some never before understood constraint on the impeachment power? First of all, it wouldn't be enforceable. Congress decides what are high crimes and misdemeanors. The courts stay out. The Supreme Court held in 1993 that impeachments are not subject to judicial review. But second, I don't want to give up the ghost that the president didn't commit incitement. I mean, I think it would be very hard to prove in a court of law. I hope Cammie can follow up on this because she has more experience in the trenches on this than I do. I think it would be hard to prove the elements in a court of law. I think the president would have at least the a plausible, if not meritorious, First Amendment defense. But in context, everything he said at the rally, right, his tweets, what he has, what he tweeted while the insurrection was ongoing. The Brandenburg test is stringent, but it's not impossible. And so, even in a world in which you actually had to show incitement as a prerequisite, or you had to show a criminal offense as a prerequisite, I think there's at least a non-laughable case to make that the president is certainly walked right up to the line in his remarks, both in person and online on Wednesday. But I'm curious what Cami thinks.
Yeah, I think, again, difficult to prove, and the incitement. So I would agree with you, Steve. And we also have to think about with some of these. A lot of these charges, these folks were there, and they were there at the Capitol, and they traveled, and so they didn't just hear that. Some of them, I'm sure, didn't just hear this speech and go down there. They had brought with them weapons, and again, there are 2 pipe bombs that had been constructed and left. So there's a fair amount of premeditation that was happening, preparation that was happening beforehand as well. So I'm quite sure that there's some folks who didn't need that level of assistance and encouragement. But I do think that the words, and particularly the words of Rudy Giuliani, who said trial by combat. I don't know how.
Combat is pretty unequivocal.
Unequivocal. That's a great word. Yeah, it's there's the president's words I find abhorrent, but a bit more ambiguous. Rudolph Giuliani's trial by combat is pretty clear.
I mean, we should say that the Justice Department said earlier today that it's not pursuing any charges relating to anything that was said at the rally. And I want to say I don't have a problem with that, because there are lots of examples of things that I think are illegal and shouldn't be prosecuted. And this to me is a textbook case of what was said at the rally, as opposed to everything that happened thereafter. And I think that's, the other part of this also is just to go back to the original question just for a second, Deborah. I think there's still a lot more to learn about what was told to the military, to the DC National Guard, both leading up to and during the day on Wednesday. I mean, if the reports, Governor Larry Hogan of Maryland, who's a Republican, if his version of events is accurate as he's explained it, then there wasn't just negligence on the part of the federal government. There was a deliberate non-response. And the notion that would not be something Congress could impeach a president for, I think, is just to describe it is to condone it.
Yeah, and I guess there's also a debate, right, of just because if something may or may not be criminal doesn't mean the president can or cannot be impeached over it, right? He can be potentially impeached over something that's.
Well, the other thing is, and even if you believe that the text of the Constitution, by limiting impeachment to cases of high crimes or other misdemeanors, thereby actually does impose a requirement that there be a crime, that's a requirement enforced by the House and the Senate and nobody else. And so, if a majority of the House and 2/3 of the Senate believe that particular conduct meets the constitutional definition, that's the end of the matter so far as the Constitution is concerned.
I just want to pick up on something you were saying, Steve, about the Governor Hogan's version of events of what happened. If maybe we could talk for a second about kind of the jurisdictional issues that are at play. I mean, DC is a non-state, and so how kind of the interplay in terms of law enforcement and where the legal authorities and jurisdictional overlays kind of come into play in protecting the Capitol and DC in general.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that this came up in a couple of the questions in the thread, because I was hoping we'd get to it. Wholly apart from who can be prosecuted for things that happened on Wednesday, I have some tough questions about exactly why the law enforcement response broke down. And Deborah, part of it could be related to the interjurisdictional cluster, that is law enforcement in DC. I mean, so just to sort of set the stage a bit, right? The Capitol Police are principally responsible for securing and policing the Capitol grounds. But there are, Cami might know the statistic, it's like 38 federal agencies with law enforcement authority somewhere in the District of Columbia, right? That's, and then there's DC. And the MPD, the Metropolitan Police Department, in general does not have the authority to police on the Capitol grounds unless they're invited, unless they're requested onto the grounds, but they were on Wednesday. And indeed, my understanding is that MPD was instrumental in actually clearing out the building. So this creates a whole bunch of questions. Right. First, there's a question of where was the National Guard? right? In most states, if this had happened, you would have seen an immediate activation of the National Guard by the relevant governor. DC is the only jurisdiction in the country where the local government does not control the National Guard. And you guys might say, well, that's because it's not a state. Well, neither is Puerto Rico or Guam or the US Virgin Islands, and those governors control their National Guards. Rather, this is actually a sort of quirky old remnant of a time before DC had a local government. Right, DC's only had a local government since the 1970s, I think 1970 specifically. So the DC Guard is under the control of the president and the Secretary of Defense, and there are going to be a lot of questions about why they weren't out in much more armed force sooner. The Maryland and Virginia Guards, right, are under the control of the governors of Maryland and Virginia respectively, but they can't be sent into DC unless one of two things happen, unless they are requested by the federal government, or unless they're requested by the mayor under something called the Emergency Management Assistance Compact. And my understanding from the Governor Hogan's interviews, at least, is that EMAC was not activated by the mayor. Rather, they were going through the Defense Department, and DOD was dragging its heels. So, you know, Deborah, I have a lot of questions about exactly why they were caught so unprepared. I saw a quote today from, I think, an FBI official in a briefing that they just didn't have intelligence that, you know, tipping them off that this was in the cards. Do they not read the internet? Right? I mean, are they not on Parler? That seems like a rather significant intelligence failure. So there are a lot of failures here that I think are also part of the conversation, although less immediately, I guess.
Right, and I want to just piggyback on something that Steve said. You know, yes, there are all of these agencies that have the jurisdictional authority, and for different things. You have the park police. You have each agency has its own. But Washington D.C. This is a protest. Washington D.C. is not a city that is not used to handling large and complicated protests, large and complicated gatherings. They do it all the time, and we don't see this. And that's not to say that we don't see some level of folks getting out of hand, but we've never had a building breached in this way. So I have to believe that that part of the failure was deliberate, and it was, and it placed, not only did it place some of the protesters, some rioters, right? They're both mixed in there. Not only did it place them in danger, it placed the officers themselves in danger, and we've lost one officer and others, dozens injured, and now we have several deaths. So it and Congress and the members of our legislative branch, and they're conducting their business. So these this is not an innocuous that kind of thing. And to your point about the intelligence, this also, we have we need to begin to pay more attention to the rise of these insurrectionist movements. There should be plenty of intelligence available to our federal law enforcement authorities about a lot of the white supremacist groups that were there, the militia movements that were represented and that are organizing themselves, right? You have a right to assemble, but you do not have a right to come and commit this type of mayhem that happened on January 6th.
So let's turn for a second to continue this conversation. Let's talk a little about redress, right? So if we actually do want to get to the bottom of what happened and we want to investigate and prevent something similar from happening, what is kind of the most effective accountability mechanisms that we can use moving forward?
Deborah, that's a big question because it's about so much more than Wednesday. And there are the small oversight questions from Wednesday, and then there are the big oversight questions from Wednesday. And when Cammie talks about the intelligence failures, that's about a lot more than Wednesday, right? Why do we have the Department of Homeland Security busy looking into social media of reporters covering the Portland protests, but unable to figure out that this was going to happen? I mean, that's how that can happen, I think, is a big question. The first thing I should say is I think it's worth stressing that a heck of a lot of people are being arrested. right? That despite what the reports might look like on Wednesday, there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of arrests today, yesterday. There will be more, and there are going to be hundreds of criminal prosecutions forthcoming, and we're going to learn a fair amount from that because there are going to be a lot of folks in a position to trade information to the government in exchange for leniency. But we need some robust congressional oversight. I would love to get behind the idea of some kind of 9/11 commission style joint bipartisan effort. But bipartisan means bipartisan, and that means senior Republicans endorsing such an enterprise, which would require senior Republicans to admit that the president lost the election. And that the 138 members of the House and the 8 senators who voted to reject Arizona's and Pennsylvania's Biden electors, admitting that they actually had no good faith basis for doing that. So I think this is the trick going forward, which is how much is going to be able to be done through bipartisanship and how much is going to require Democrats taking advantage of the fact that at least as of January 20th, they're going to control the political branches. And I think that's a very hard call and depends to at least some degree on Republicans as much as it depends upon Democrats.
Yeah, I agree. Must be bipartisan, but also when we think about what happened at the Capitol, again, we've got 50 state capitals. We've got state governments, and we saw what happened in Michigan with the governor and the plot there that was uncovered. But we have to make sure that hate crimes, bias crimes, and insurrection and the rise of militia groups. It's been happening. People have been warning for the last 10 years or more that there's an increase here. And so we need to, again, devote our federal resources to, honestly, to looking in our own backyard at home in domestic terrorism.
I just want to return the conversation a little bit to kind of the news of the day, right? President Trump still being in office. Conversations about the 25th Amendment, there's conversation about impeachment. And while a few Republicans have kind of come around to those ideas, a lot have not. Lindsey Graham actually has a quote saying that if the president does anything else, quote, all options should be on the table. But that still gives us 12 days. So in the next 12 days, if President Trump were to give an order that people of conscience didn't want to follow, what are the options that exist for while he's still in office, if such an order were given, if any?
So, I mean, Deborah, assuming you mean in the military, right? So
Yes.
The folks have been talking about this for a while, unfortunately, and hoping that it was just an academic conversation, and here we are, and it's not. So it's tricky because the story, for example, about Speaker Pelosi calling the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and making sure the president didn't have the authority to launch nuclear weapons. The chairman can't disobey a lawful order from the president of the United States. He's committing a felony if he does, right? And so, the military is supposed to have the power to disobey unlawful orders, but that puts a heck of a lot of pressure on them in the moment to determine, which orders are lawful and which ones are not. Now, I have a ton of faith in our military, perhaps more faith than I should. But I also think that's we should not be too comfortable in the idea that it's going to be clear in the moment which orders are lawful and which are not. If the president turns around and says, I want to launch a nuclear, weapon at Iran right now, that might be an easy call for the military, but there's a heck of a lot of stuff short of that. Right? If the president wants to deploy the military in and around DC on January 17th, in response to what I gather is going to be the next big, gathering of his supporters. Is that an unlawful order? I don't think so, right? So, I think there are real vulnerabilities in the chain of command that underscore the push for some action before the 20th, right? That underscore why there are a lot of people who don't think the Lindsey Graham, Bob Corker view that we should just, 12 days is a short period of time. A lot can happen in 12 days, and the president is still the president until he's not.
Cammie, did you want to add anything or? Okay. So part of why people I think are still talking about impeachment is not just for the 12 days, but also disqualification from future office, potentially disqualification from future office. Is there any other way, any other mechanism to disqualify someone from holding future office outside of kind of the impeachment and then that subsequent vote?
The only one I know of is there's 1 or 2 criminal statutes, and the insurrection statute is one of them. I want to get the text right, so bear with me for a second. But the insurrection statute says, if you're convicted of this offense, you shall be incapable of holding any office under the United States. Now that's narrower than Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment also applies to state offices, but there are at least a couple of statutes that bring with them disqualification from holding future office. Of course, these are statutes that have pretty high proof thresholds, right? These are not going to be the easier ones to prove from Wednesday's events.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, again, those few statutes that would prohibit you from holding in office. But I think, again, the importance in thinking about impeachment, you know, yes, it can be, you know, a long and grueling process. Not even sure that we could get the Senate vote on that, right? The 2/3 majority required or something. But to make sure that this person cannot, you know, run for office and exact the type of damage to our institutions, again, would be important.
So in addition to President Trump, I mean, it would be great to hear your thoughts about kind of what options are available for members of Congress potentially as well who have culpability for Wednesday's attack, expulsion. Are there other kind of statutes or mechanisms that should be under consideration, and who those should apply to?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is so to what extent are we going to hold political leaders responsible, right? So, you know, I think we're up to 10 state representatives have been identified among the video of the rioters from Wednesday. There are mechanisms under, I think, most states' laws for removing members. I think maybe even every state's law for removing members of the state legislature. You know, I think that's a conversation to be had on the state by state level. But you know, I also think there ought to be a fair amount of pressure on these folks to resign. I mean, Senator Murray, who is not exactly one for hyperbole, was, I think, the first prominent sitting Democratic senator today to suggest that Senator Hawley should resign for, you know, not just his responsibility for what happened beforehand, but also for, you know, even after Wednesday's events, still pushing the narrative and not backing down and not doing what, you know, Senator Lankford and Senator Loeffler, to their credit, did, which was actually withdraw their objections to certification after Wednesday's violence. You know, I think we should not be nearly as timid when it comes to political remedies for members of the legislature at the state or federal level who are so grossly, you know, miscarrying the duties of their office. But we have been historically, and I think that's part of why, you know, so far it's been a minority of voices, not a majority of them.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because you have you have people who, again, continued with the stop the steal, right? Like what is their culpability? And I find that a bit tenuous, but I think that you have the state representative from West Virginia who's in the Capitol. You know, that is to me a very clear-cut case of someone who could be removed from office or pressured to resign.
I'm sorry, I'm having a problem with my mute button. I want to turn the conversation to the question of pardons. Even before Wednesday, the president was doing a lot of pardoning on his way out, and there is a bit of concern that there could be more pardons or a self-pardon even on his way out. Can we talk a little bit about how that plays into accountability for what happened on Wednesday? Both for the president as well as for the rioters, because even if they're pardoned, are there kind of state analogs? That whole kind of query of questions.
Right, back to the weird jurisdictional status of DC. So first things first, on the self-pardon question, I mean, let's just sort of, obviously we have no precedent. I think the general consensus is that the answer is no. But the only way to actually test that, and you know, I think a lot of folks have pointed this out, is for a president to try it and then be prosecuted by the federal government, right? Like that's the only way you'd ever find an answer to that. And so the irony is that a self-pardon would actually almost be daring the Biden administration to indict Trump just because DOJ might not want to let that precedent just sit out there. Of course, the other problem for President Trump is that a pardon only extends to federal crimes. And at least for him, that does nothing to stop Cy Vance, the district attorney in Manhattan, from continuing with his investigations into Trump's finances, the foundation, et cetera. But, with regard to what happened in DC on Wednesday specifically, once again, here's a quirk about DC. Almost all violations of the DC code are violations of federal law, and therefore fall within the president's, not the mayor's, pardon power. So could the president issue some kind of blanket pardon for any offense that was committed on Wednesday? Constitutionally, I actually think the answer is yes. And that would be yet another reason to impeach him or disable him under the 25th Amendment, either before he could do that or right after he does it.
Cammie, is there anything you wanted to add?
No, except for again, the presidential pardon power. That is something we have. The Constitution allows the president to make these pardons, but it's very disturbing when you've had a very a long federal investigation, like in the case of the Blackwater contractors and the violence and everything that we saw there. And again, it just begs the question of for whom is the criminal law? It's traditionally reserved for, though, if you're not a friend or a contributor of this president, then you may not have been able to get that power. So I'm really worried about the long-term damage that it's done to our institutions and to the rule of law, and just a wide swath of our country, not the folks that we saw on January 6th, but a lot of Black and Brown communities who are not able to benefit from this, and the damage that's being done there, and the illegitimacy with which those communities see the criminal justice system is, again, something that we have to take up.
Just following up on this conversation a little bit more, this is an audience of lawyers. So there are lots of government attorneys, I'm sure, who are on this call today. And if you were kind of that government attorney who is now being asked to prepare pardon papers, are there kind of concerns that you would have at this point for your own kind of culpability?
Oh, that's a big one. I almost want to punt to Cam because I don't really want to answer that, but I'll take a stab. So listen, everyone has to keep their own counsel about their ethics and their morals, and it's not my place to tell you what your ethics and morals are. I do think, and I do hope, that folks who are in the government and are asked in the next 12 days to do things that go against their conscience and their morals, think about whether there's a mechanism for them to actually push back against the action through channels. And if not, think seriously about whether, abiding something with which they so vehemently disagree is worth maintaining their current position. I am not a fan of the senior Trump officials who have only just now found what I think Secretary DeVos called her inflection point. But rank and file folks who have been trying their best for 4 years to just do their jobs and keep their heads down are a different class and a different question altogether. So, I hope folks aren't put in that impossible situation, but when you are, I just hope that they don't fear the consequences for actually putting their morals ahead of their orders.
Yeah, in terms of the ethical obligations of lawyers, if you believe that you've been asked to do something that is a violation of ethics, there are, the DOJ still has an ethics office, right? To ask these questions. But again, the fact that you're questioning so much is really the issue, that these 4 years have led us to this point to question whether or not the mechanisms and the systems that we have in place are going to be adequate.
I just want to bring us back as we're kind of closing out to something Cammie was talking about in her remarks in terms of the racial inequities in terms of policing that we really saw come to light on Wednesday. And just your thoughts on whether or not what we saw on Wednesday can kind of give momentum for some comprehensive reform of law enforcement to address the racial biases and inequities that we've seen for a long time.
Here's the thing. We have the George Floyd was it was a horrible thing for people to see to happen and for people to see, but there are many George Floyds that preceded George Floyd. So the momentum that we've seen, these aggressions have happened in communities of color for decades. And so this is not new. We have the tools to address police violence and police accountability. There's the section, the pattern or practice authority that the United States government has that the Trump administration did not enforce at all in the 4 years that he was in office. And so it was vigorously used under the Obama administration. We hope to see the ability of the federal government to work with local police departments, figure out the unconstitutional violations, the patterns that are happening, and figure out appropriate remedies. And the communities should be involved. But again, this is not new. We have the tools. We know what to do. We have not had the political will to do it. And this precedes the Trump administration, unfortunately.
And I'll just piggyback on that to say, I actually think what happened on Tuesday is more important than what happened on Wednesday when it comes to meaningful law enforcement reform. And by that, I mean the Georgia runoffs, because, I think there's a much greater chance of some kind of meaningful legislation getting through Congress with the Democratic majority, with, at least a nominal Democratic majority in the Senate and with the Democratic president than even than there was last summer when there was such a groundswell for it. And as importantly, I think this is the really interesting, long-term political question. Steve Schmidt, who was, I think, John McCain's campaign manager in 2008, he tweeted that, this is gonna fracture the Republican Party, right, between the sort of the Trumpist wing of the Republican Party and the less Trumpist wing of the Republican Party. And the question is whether in a Biden administration, there are going to be efforts to try to keep some of the less Trumpy Republicans on board with some kinds of these reforms, right? Mitt Romney, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski. And if not, is that going to be enough to convince Joe Manchin to agree to blow up the filibuster? I just think, a lot of what Cammie's talking about is possible at the federal level, if and only if there's a real effort on the part of the Democrats to push this through as a policy agenda.
Well, we are running out of time. I just want to give both of you a chance if there's any kind of concluding thoughts or things you wanted to get across that we haven't covered.
I think what I would say to close is just the fact that, again, emphasizing that what we saw on Capitol Hill was a systemic failure. I know that Stephen Son has resigned. I know that there are more resignations within the Capitol Police to maybe forthcoming. But we have to have an investigation or commission to figure out, because these failures, it wasn't just something that happened on Wednesday. The intelligence failures, which again, I'm not even sure that I believe that they didn't know that something like this was afoot, but the lack of preparedness caused caused deaths. And also, how do we look now to other nations and to know that it was possible to breach the Capitol in that way with our legislators inside? So we have to take this up on so many different levels.
And I would just say, I don't want to repeat myself. The only thing I would say is, we spend a lot of time talking about sort of theories of executive power in law schools and in common law classrooms. And I think we've seen as transparently as we ever could the dangers of what has been the sexiest theory of executive power among conservatives for the last 30 years, which is the unitary executive. Right, which is that if you take the unitary executive to its full stopping point, there's almost no mechanism to stop a president from doing what the president did on Wednesday. and that, if anything, hopefully the events of the last few days, if not the last few years, allow us to reinvigorate a serious conversation about better distributing the powers between the political branches as opposed to allowing so much to drift to the executive.
Well, with that, I just want to thank Professor Vladeck and Professor Chavis so much for being with us today. This was a really fantastic conversation. As Steve, you said at the top of your remarks, I wish it was under better circumstances. These are really tough days for our country, but we're grateful that we could all come together today to have this forum and to discuss the legal issues at play. So thanks again, and see everyone
Thanks,
soon.
Deborah. Thanks, Cami, and thanks to everybody who watched. Looks like we had a good audience.
Thank you all. Thanks.